Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on a concept from the Quran. It's fundamental to Islam, but it can be kind of a head scratcher, even for folks who know their way around the religion. We're talking about the spirit. And hey, we get it. You might be coming into this with, zero background in the Quran. So think of us as your tour guides through this whole idea. We'll be breaking down some seriously in-depth stuff, like some real scholarly analyses, to uncover what this spirit tells us about God, about creation, and even about what it means, like, to be human.
You got it. And here's the thing, the Quran itself, it doesn't just hand us a simple definition of spirit, which, by the way, is called ruh in Arabic.
Okay, so ruh, that's what we're calling it.
Right. So, yeah, right from the start, we're dealing with something, that's open to interpretation. There's going to be some debate about this
All
one.
right, so no easy answers here.
Fair.
Enough. But, where do we even start wrapping our heads around this ruh?
So the word ruh, it pops up in all sorts of different spots in the Quran. Sometimes you'll find it tied to angels. Sometimes it's talking about a separate thing God created. And sometimes it's even used as a way to describe, divine inspiration.
Huh. So are we talking like a force, a being, a metaphor? What's the deal?
$1 million question right there.
Yeah.
And honestly, the Quran, it doesn't really give us a straight answer. It's fascinating, right? Now, some scholars, they look at ruh and they see a metaphor. It's a way of explaining God's power, God's will. Kind of like, when we talk about the spirit of the law, we're not talking about a ghost, right? We mean the idea behind the rules.
Oh, I see. So like a way of understanding how God interacts with the world, basically.
Bingo. But then you've got other scholars, and they interpret ruh as a separate being, something God created with a specific job to do. And this is where those different ways it's used, it all comes into play. Is it a messenger? Is it hanging out with the angels? Is it even involved in how humans were made?
Wait, hold up. You're saying ruh might have something to do with how we were created? Okay, now you've got my attention.
Well, there are verses in the Quran, right? And they describe God breathing this spirit, this ruh, into humans. And a lot of people, they understand this as the moment when, we became different from everything else. We got self-awareness, we got intellect, and we got this capacity to, to connect with God on a spiritual level.
It's like this ruh it's like the divine spark, right? The thing that makes us human.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something special about us, something that sets us apart from the rest of creation. It gives us this unique relationship with God.
Okay, but if ruh is this key part of what makes us human, what about, the soul? Are we talking about the same thing here?
That's a great question. And you know what? Scholars have been going back and forth about that one for centuries. There are definitely verses in the Quran that link spirit and the human soul. They're blurring the lines between the two. And it gets right to the heart of how the Quran sees the connection between the divine, God, and us, humanity.
All right, so we're talking about something deep here. It's layered. It's mysterious even. No wonder there's so much debate going on about ruh.
And believe it or not, we've just scratched the surface. There's a whole lot more to unpack. How did ruh play a role in how the Quran was revealed, and how do different branches of Islam interpret this whole idea? It gets really fascinating.
Okay, I am hooked. Let's take a quick pause here, but don't go anywhere, because we're about to get into even more fascinating stuff about the spirit in the Quran. We'll be right back.
Right after this. Welcome back to our deep dive into the spirit, or, ruh in the Quran.
So before the break, we were getting into how ruh is connected to our souls. And it got me thinking about, what happens when we die? Does the Quran say anything about, where ruh goes after death?
Oh, it definitely does. This is where the idea of the afterlife comes in. See, in the Quran, death is described as, the soul returning to God. Now, in Islam, you have different schools of thought, right? And they have different takes on how ruh fits into all of this.
Okay, so let's break down some of those different interpretations. What are some common beliefs about ruh and the afterlife?
One way of looking at it is that ruh is like a guide for the soul, as it travels back to God. It's like a companion that helps the soul navigate that whole transition from the physical world to the spiritual realm.
So ruh doesn't just vanish when we die. It sticks around. It's still a part of our spiritual journey.
That's the idea. And it really emphasizes how important it is to nurture our connection with ruh while we're here in this life. How we live, the choices we make, our relationship with God, all of that, it can affect the state of our ruh, which then impacts our experience in the afterlife.
Well, that adds a whole new layer to the idea of, spiritual growth, doesn't it? It's not just about being a good person. It's about nurturing that connection with our ruh.
Yeah.
So we can have a a good experience in the afterlife.
Exactly. It highlights the importance of living in accordance with God's will and, striving for spiritual purity. And like you said, different schools of thought have their own takes on this. For instance, in Sufism, which is kind of a mystical branch of Islam, they see Ruh as the key to achieving this really profound union with God,
Hmm.
both in this life and the next. They believe that by purifying and elevating their Ruh, they can transcend earthly limitations and experience a direct connection with the divine.
Wow, that sounds intense. So even within Islam, there's a whole range of beliefs about what Ruh means and how it affects our spiritual journey.
Exactly. And that diversity of thought, you know what? That's part of what makes exploring the Quran so enriching. It encourages us to consider different viewpoints, to really think about the deeper meanings, and to ultimately come to our own understanding of these complex concepts.
Speaking of deeper meanings, we've been talking about how scholars interpret Ruh.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about its role in the revelation of the Quran itself. Like, how does Ruh fit into that whole story?
Now, this is where things get super interesting. The Quran says that it was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad through the Spirit, and often this Spirit is identified as the angel Gabriel. So in this context, Ruh is like the bridge for divine communication, bringing God's word to humanity.
So it's like Ruh is the messenger, delivering God's message to the Prophet Muhammad, who then shares it with everyone else.
Exactly. And this really highlights how important Ruh is in establishing the authenticity and the divine origin of the Quran. For Muslims, the Quran is the literal word of God,
Yeah.
unchanged by humans. And it's the spirit that ensures that purity, that transmission.
That's a powerful idea. It really elevates the Quran. It gives it a level of sacredness and authority that shapes the entire belief system of Islam.
Definitely. And even though there are, these debates about what exactly Ruh is it a metaphorical force? Is it a distinct being? Or is it even the angel Gabriel himself, but its role in Revelation? That's undeniable. It connects God and humanity, makes divine communication possible.
Okay, so we've got Ruh as a messenger, as a guide for souls in the afterlife, potentially even making union with God possible, all while being this mysterious force that's like woven into us. My head is spinning.
And there's more. Remember all those different ways Ruh is used in the Quran that we talked about earlier? Each of those little nuances, it adds another layer to this concept. It makes it even more complex, more meaningful.
Like when you mentioned that Ruh can be associated with angels,
Mhm.
how does that tie in with everything else we've been talking about?
Well, some scholars think that Ruh is a specific type of angel, maybe even the highest ranking angel, and its job is to carry out God's most important commands, including, revelation. Other scholars, they see Ruh as separate from angels, but it still has this spiritual essence, this close connection to the divine realm.
So whether it's an angel or a divine force or something else entirely, it seems like Ruh exists on this spiritual plane, like beyond what we normally experience as humans.
Exactly. And this is where the mystery and the wonder of Ruh really come alive. It makes us think differently about reality. It makes us acknowledge that there are realms beyond what we can perceive. And it makes us consider these profound ways that the divine interacts with the world.
I don't know about you, but I'm getting this feeling of awe, just thinking about all the implications of Ruh. It's like we're looking at this huge, intricate tapestry, and every thread has a deeper meaning.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And honestly, we're just starting to untangle the threads of this tapestry. There's so much more to explore, from all the philosophical discussions about what Ruh is to its role in Islamic mysticism and spirituality.
Well, I'm ready to go even deeper. But before we get lost in all those intricate threads, let's just take a second to recap what we've learned so far about the spirit in the Quran. What are the key takeaways here for our listeners?
All right, so first things first. Ruh is not a simple concept with a clear-cut definition. It's got many facets. It's open to interpretation. Scholars even debate it. Second, Ruh plays a crucial role in what Muslims believe, connecting to everything from God's power in creation to the revelation of the Quran to our own spiritual journeys as human beings.
And third, Ruh is still relevant today. It makes you think, even if you're not Muslim. It raises questions about what's real, about God, about what it means to be human.
Absolutely. It pushes us to think beyond just the material world and to consider all the mysteries that are out there beyond what we can immediately see.
Okay, I think our listeners need a minute to process all of that before we dive back in. Let's take a quick pause, and we'll be right back with even more insights into the fascinating world of Ruh in the Quran. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been like on this amazing journey exploring the spirit or, the Ruh in the Quran. It's like so much deeper and more complex than I ever thought.
For sure, for sure. And don't forget, we're keeping in mind that you might be coming to this with no knowledge of the Quran or Islamic thought, right? So we're trying to explain everything clearly and connect all the dots.
Absolutely. So let's pick up where we left off. We were talking about how Ruh can be connected to angels and how it plays a part in how the Quran was revealed. But what about how Ruh affects people?
Yeah.
How does this concept impact the lives of Muslims?
Well, one big thing is that Ruh is seen as like the source of our moral compass. It's that voice inside us that tells us what's right and wrong, that pushes us to be compassionate, to be just, to be kind. It's like a compass, pointing us towards a life that aligns with God's will.
So it's like Ruh is saying, hey, live a life that makes God happy.
Right.
But we have free will, right? Can we ignore that inner voice? What if we choose to do the opposite?
That's where the idea of accountability comes in. Muslims believe that what we do in this life has an impact on what happens in the afterlife. And the state of our Ruh, it plays a big part in deciding our fate. If we've taken care of our Ruh by living a good life, we can expect good things in the afterlife. But if we've ignored our Ruh and kept doing things that go against our moral compass, well, the consequences could be, let's say, not so good.
So it's like we have this responsibility because of Ruh. It's not just something that's there. It's something we need to work on, to nurture.
Exactly. And that means things like praying, fasting, giving to charity, and trying to live by Islamic values every day. These are all ways to purify and elevate our Ruh. It brings us closer to God and gets us ready for a positive experience in the afterlife.
That makes sense. It's all about matching our actions with our inner compass, with the guidance of Ruh. But what exactly do Muslims believe about the afterlife? What does Ruh do there?
The Quran describes the afterlife as a place with both rewards and punishments. For those who have taken care of their Ruh and lived right, there's paradise. It's a place of pure bliss and closeness to God. But for those who have ignored their Ruh and disobeyed God's will, there's the chance of hell, which is, well, suffering and separation from God.
Wow, that's quite a difference. It definitely makes you think about taking our spiritual journey seriously.
It does. But it's important to remember that these descriptions of paradise and hell are symbolic. They represent spiritual states. The real truth of the afterlife is a mystery that only God knows.
So even though the Quran gives us some details, there's still a lot we don't know about the afterlife.
Absolutely. And I think that mystery, it makes us think, it makes us humble. It reminds us that we can't understand everything about God's plan or what happens after this life, but we can trust in God's justice and mercy and try to live in a way that pleases Him, and our Ruh will guide us on that path.
This deep dive into the spirit in the Quran has been a real eye-opener for me. It's like so much richer and more layered than I thought it would be.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, we've barely scratched the surface here. There's so much more to uncover about Ruh, from those philosophical debates about what it is to its role in Islamic mysticism and art. But I hope this has given you a good starting point for understanding it all.
It totally has. And I think this idea of Ruh, it goes beyond just Islam. It makes us all think about those deeper parts of ourselves, about our connection to something bigger, about why we're here and what our lives mean.
Couldn't agree more. It reminds us that there's more to life than just what we can see and touch. That we all have this spiritual core, this Ruh that guides us and connects us to the divine.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to think about what really stood out to you about Ruh. Maybe it makes you curious about Islam or other spiritual traditions, or maybe it just makes you want to pay more attention to that voice inside, that moral compass that points you towards a life of meaning.
And remember, the journey doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep looking for a deeper understanding of yourself and the world around you.
That's the perfect way to end things. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive into the spirit in the Quran. Until next time, keep exploring.